Block 1. The Weakling Verdict. History has a convenient way of burying its sins under the guise of standard procedure. If you were to walk into a prestigious American hospital at the turn of the 20th century, you would find sterilized instruments, starched white coats, and an atmosphere of unshakable scientific authority. But if you listened closely, past the murmurs of rounds and the scratching of pens on charts, you would hear a silence that was far more terrifying. It was the silence of the nursery wards, where premature babies were left to die, not by accident, but by design. In the eyes of the medical elite, these infants were not patients, they were biological errors. They were weaklings, a term stamped onto their medical files with the cold finality of a judge's gavel. We like to believe that medicine has always been a crusade to save life, but in the late 1800s, the shadow of eugenics stretched long and dark across the halls of academia. The prevailing wisdom, championed by the most respected men in the field, was that a baby born too early was unfit for survival. To intervene, to use technology to prolong their struggle, was considered a violation of natural law. It was believed that by saving these genetically inferior children, doctors would be weakening the human stock. So, when a terrified mother held a 2-pound infant in her cupped hands, begging for help, the answer she received from the most educated men of her time was a shrug. "Let nature take its course," they said, turning their backs as the child's body temperature plummeted. This was the verdict of the weakling. It was a death sentence delivered with the arrogance of those who believed they understood the will of the universe. Yet the tragedy is not just that they refused to help, but that the means to save these children already existed. In France, a device known as the incubator, essentially a heated glass box that mimicked the womb, had been developed years prior. It was simple, it was effective, and it was entirely rejected by the American medical establishment. Why? Because it was seen as un-American, unscientific, and frankly, undignified. Leading obstetricians mocked the device, calling it a peanut roaster. They argued that if a baby could not survive the ambient temperature of a room, it had no business living at all. Imagine the sheer suffocating weight of that era. You are a parent. You know a machine exists that could keep your child warm, that could filter the air they breathe, that could give them the one thing they don't have: time. And yet the guardians of health, the gatekeepers of life and death, refuse to use it. They point to the incubator not as a medical tool, but as a circus prop, a novelty for the gullible. The archives are filled with heart-wrenching accounts of fathers traveling from hospital to hospital, carrying dying infants in shoeboxes wrapped in cotton, only to be turned away at every door. The establishment didn't just fail these families, it actively blocked their path to survival. The incubators gathered dust in storage rooms or were never ordered at all, while the weaklings were placed in drafty corners to fade away, their names never even recorded in the census. History prefers to forget this chapter, to gloss over the time when the smartest men in the room decided who was worthy of a future and who was trash. But we must remember, because it was in this darkness that an unlikely light began to flicker, not in a hospital, but in the last place anyone would look for salvation. The 25-cent sanctuary. If the hospital was a temple of cold indifference, the boardwalk of Coney Island was a cathedral of chaos. It was a place of sticky cotton candy, screaming roller coaster riders, and the rhythmic crash of the Atlantic waves. It was here, amidst the fire eaters, the bearded ladies, and the sword swallowers, that the rejected babies found their sanctuary. This is where the story shifts from a medical tragedy to a surreal, almost unbelievable defiance. While the titans of medicine sat in their ivory towers discussing genetic purity, a man named Couney was building a hospital in the middle of a carnival. He called it the Infantorium, a name that sounded equal parts scientific and theatrical, perfectly suited for the Midway. Couney was a man of contradictions. He wore immaculate tuxedos, smoked expensive cigars, and carried himself with the gravitas of a European professor. Yet the medical establishment viewed him with absolute disdain. They labeled him a charlatan, a huckster, a monster who exploited the misfortune of families for a quick buck. And on the surface, their accusations seemed plausible. To enter his facility, the public had to pay an admission fee of 25 cents. Visitors would file past a barker shouting about the amazing tiny humans, pressing their faces against a glass rail to stare at babies so small they could fit in a man's hand. It had all the trappings of a freak show, and the newspapers of the day were merciless, publishing cartoons that depicted Couney as a vampire feeding on the curiosity of the mob. But those who paid their quarter and stepped inside found something that silenced the mockery. The Infantorium was not a dirty sideshow tent. It was the most advanced neonatal intensive care unit in the world. The floors were scrubbed to a shine that rivaled any operating theater. The nurses, dressed in starched white uniforms, were highly trained professionals who followed strict protocols of hygiene that were decades ahead of their time. And inside those glass boxes, the same peanut roasters the elite had laughed at were the babies that the hospitals had thrown away. The air was filtered, the temperature was regulated with obsessive precision, and the babies were fed a specialized diet. The terrible irony, the detail that history tried to scrub away, is that the 25 cents paid by the gawking public was the only thing keeping these children alive. The cost of care for a single premature baby in 1903 was roughly $15 a day, equivalent to over $400 today. It was a sum no ordinary family could afford, and no hospital was willing to subsidize. Martin Couney never charged the parents a single penny. The show paid for the medicine. The curiosity of strangers funded the oxygen. The exploitation was in reality a desperate, brilliant engine of philanthropy. While critics screamed about ethics, Couney was achieving an 85% survival rate, a number that was statistically impossible according to the leading textbooks of the time. Yet the emotional toll on Couney was immense. He lived in a constant state of siege, battling health inspectors who wanted to shut him down and real doctors who called him a fraud. And the darkest secret of all, the one he guarded with his life, is that he likely held no valid medical license at all. He was an imposter in the eyes of the law, a fake doctor. But when his own daughter was born prematurely, weighing less than 3 pounds, he didn't take her to a hospital. He put her in one of his own glass boxes on the boardwalk, entrusting her life to the Sideshow, because he knew it was the only place on earth where she stood a chance. He was fighting a war on 2 fronts, against the biology that wanted to kill these children, and against the society that said they weren't worth saving. Time has a way of revealing the true nature of our actions, stripping away titles and accolades to show what remains. For 40 years, Martin Couney ran his show. The carnival seasons came and went. The lights of Luna Park rose and fell, and the world changed around him. But inside the glass walls of the Infantorium, the mission remained constant. As the decades passed, a strange phenomenon began to occur. The sideshow babies, the ones who were supposed to be genetic failures, began to return. They came back as teenagers, as university students, as soldiers in uniform, as mothers holding babies of their own. They came to shake the hand of the man the medical world called a fraud. These reunions were not recorded in medical journals. They happened quietly, amidst the noise of the boardwalk, a living testament to a success rate that no amount of academic theory could refute. Slowly, painfully, the establishment was forced to swallow its pride. The evidence was simply too overwhelming to ignore. By the late 1930s, hospitals began to send their interns to the Carnival, not to mock, but to learn. They watched how Couney's nurses handled the infants, how the incubators were regulated, how the weaklings were coaxed into life. The very institutions that had once slammed their doors in the faces of desperate parents were now quietly copying the blueprints of the freak show. It was a vindication, but it was a silent one. No grand apology was issued. No statues were erected in the courtyards of the medical schools. The hospitals simply adopted the technology, renamed the wards neonatal intensive care units, and pretended that the idea had been theirs all along. Martin Couney died in 1950, alone and destitute. He had spent every dime he ever made on the care of his graduates. His obituary was brief, and for decades his name was effectively erased from the history of medicine. He was an embarrassment to the profession, an unlicensed showman who had outperformed the professors. It was easier to forget him than to admit that a carnival barker had possessed more humanity than the deans of medicine. But names have power, and the truth is a stubborn thing. Today, every time a premature baby is placed in a warm, glowing incubator, every time a monitor beeps in an NICU, it is an echo of the boardwalk. We are compelled to ask, who was the real doctor? Was it the man with the framed degree on his wall who turned his back on a dying child because the textbook said it was hopeless? Or was it the man in the tuxedo standing next to the sword swallower who said, "Bring them to me"? Martin Couney was never Dr. Couney in the eyes of the board, but to 6,500 human beings, he was the only physician who mattered. He proved that sometimes salvation doesn't come from the places we expect. It doesn't come from the clean, well-lit institutions of power. Sometimes it comes from the shadows, from the outcasts, from the people crazy enough to believe that a life is worth fighting for, even when the whole world says, let it go. His legacy is not written in ink. It is written in the breath of generations who lived because he refused to listen to the verdict of his time. He was a healer not by permission, but by action, and that, in the end, is the only title that survives.